Okay, so welcome to the Educational Research Department's online seminar. We're joined today by postgraduate students, staff and other interested colleagues. You will be able to ask questions at the end of the presentation or via the Zoom chat during the presentation, and I'll read them at the end. The session is being recorded and the recording will be available on the departmental website. During the presentation, please can all attendees switch off their camera and mute their microphone during the presentation. Thank you. I'd like to now introduce Dr. Oliver Mutanga. Oliver, and welcome him to University of Lancaster. Oliver is an inclusive development scholar. He is an assistant professor in the Graduate School of Education at Nazarbayev University in Kazakhstan, as well as a research associate of the University of South Africa. His research focuses on disability, education, health and indigenous native studies. Oliver, whenever you're ready, I would like to invite you to start the presentation and I will mute and turn off my camera.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you, Carmen, and everyone for the invitation. I'm sorry that I couldn't share my screen with you, so Carmen will be sharing the screen with everyone. So today I'm just going to share with you a paper which I'm trying to develop. It's not yet ready, but it's a paper that I'm trying to develop. I'm trying to develop an argument for Ubuntu philosophy, bringing in Ubuntu philosophy into the public-private good debates. And I'm happy that Paul is here. He has done some work on public-private good. So your insights will be valuable. Next slide, Carmen. Yeah, so basically within, I think, the next 30 or 35 minutes, I am going to share with you this paper. And basically the paper, I'm trying to explore how Ubuntu philosophy transcends the public-private binary in higher education. Then let me start with a disclaimer that I think while there's a distinction between global north and global south, I will be using these terminologies in my paper. And but the divide between global north and global south and Western and Southern epistemologies remains a useful tools in terms of analyzing issues. It is increasingly becoming complicated because of historical entanglements, cultural exchanges, and the fluidity of knowledge systems. I think Walter Rodin actually says that African indigenous systems have also impacted on European education systems. So really we cannot say there's purely a Western epistemologies and Southern epistemologies because of this fluidity. Moreover, there are also variations within and between different contexts. So when I'm talking about the ways in which Western systems view the public good, France is a different approach to the UK. The UK is a different approach to Poland. Poland is a different approach to Nordic countries. So just bear that in mind. Then also there are complexities within the global south, global north dichotomy. Within global south, we see some aspects of the global north. If you take example of South Africa, where some universities in South Africa resemble the elitist approach of global north universities. Then if you take indigenous communities in the global north, they also resemble some elements of institutions in the global south. So yeah, just bear this in mind as I proceed with my talk. So this paper is structured as follows. I will critically examine the theoretical foundations of the public-private good debate and to interrogate its limitations. Then subsequent chapters, subsequent section, I will look at Zimbabwe higher education as a case study, drawing on other Southern African countries to give a context. Then in the fourth section, I will introduce Ubuntu philosophy as an alternative framework for addressing this public-private good binary. So that's how I'm going to structure this presentation. Then I'll also focus on the implications for an Ubuntu philosophy based approach to public-private good approach to higher education. Then I'll conclude. Next slide, Carmen. Yeah, so in this paper, I am trying to make three key contributions to the public-private good in higher education debate. So firstly, I want to move beyond the public-private binary by arguing that Ubuntu philosophy eradicates this dichotomy rather than merely shifting the emphasis towards public good arguments. Then secondly, I want to engage with Ubuntu philosophy's critiques by proposing a balanced and relational approach to higher education, a model that preserves both the individuality and the collectivity well-being. Then lastly, I will present concrete recommendations by exploring how Ubuntu can inform governance structures in higher education, funding models, curriculum reforms, and these three aspects. So coming back to the public-private good binary, these are the definitions that are mostly given, that public goods are non-excludable and non-rivalry. And this binary have its roots in Western economic traditions that classify goods as public or private. And this actually goes back to ancient Rome, where the governance structures, the governance of a society often revolves around the complex interplays between various concepts that define the collective and individual priorities. Among these concepts, we have a republic, the public, and the public good. So the concept of public originates from the Latin term publicus, meaning that of the people. This denotes the collective identity of the populace, the establishing a foundation for a shared community identity that is central to the functions of both a republic and the pursuit of public good. Then the term republic signifies a form of governance where the power is vested in the public or its representative, as opposed to a monarch. And here, then the case of the UK then presents a very interesting case, because there is a monarch, but again, we talk of public good. So deriving from the Latin res publica or public affair, it suggests a system organized around the welfare of the public as a whole. So the public good then refers to the benefits or well-being that accrue to the community collectively. So this has been talked about from philosophers like Aristotle and Rousseau, and later defined in economic terms. The public good encapsulates the objectives of a republic's governance, that is, to implement laws and policies that are entirely for the uplift of the community rather than selective individuals. So the problem then is the discourse on pure public goods, which are theoretically non-excludable and non-rivalrous, is challenging. It's complex. Because if we apply it to practical examples, such as, let's take an example of clean air or national defense. These are some of the examples that are given. Factors like pollution and selective security measures then indicate that this good can become rivalrous and excludable under certain conditions. So then you can see that it is really complicated here. We cannot really say there is purely a public good and a private good based on these definitions. So in terms of how it came to the higher education, neoliberal policies then they have reinforced this distinction by emphasizing the economic returns of higher education over the broader societal contributions. But the private public good theoretical framework then fails to capture the complexities or the value of higher education. So philosopher Richard Rorty made a distinction between public and public spheres. And he argues that the private sphere is the domain where individual self-creation, where people pursue personal fulfillment through intellectual projects. The public sphere, according to him, then is, in contrast, is where collective action occurs, centered on justice, democratic deliberation, and societal cooperation. So he maintains this strict and rigid separation, but this strict separation may also overshadow questions of social justice and collective well-being and welfare. So this differentiation or this binary has had implications even for higher education in terms of funding, access, and policy priorities, regardless of it being there being a false dichotomy that ignores communal and interdependent educational models. So if we move to the next slide, Carmen. Yeah. So the challenges of this binary in terms of and its adoption in neoliberalism and how it affects higher education is that it leads to commodification of higher education, where priorities are given to only the economic returns of higher education over social benefits. That's most governments will then argue that it's the individual who is going to get the education and benefit from it, so they should pay for that. And this has led to high rises in tuition fees in higher education, student debt, and deepening educational inequalities. I've seen this in the UK, where universities, if you take universities in London and those universities, some of the universities in the Midlands area, and up north, they all fight to have students, and then student profiles within those universities are different. So that's creating inequalities. Then market-driven policies have reshaped education. Now it's mostly issues to do with productivity, if it's for staff or researchers or lecturers, impact factor journals over quality, and also in terms of accessibility. Not every student who wants to have education is getting that education or similar quality education. Next slide, Carmen. Yeah. So turning to Zimbabwe as a case study, historically, we got our education, the modern education that we are talking of. It was born out of colonialism as a colonial project where the majority were excluded. So the education as a whole, including higher education in Zimbabwe, was a colonial project, and the majority were only educated to the extent of being literate and being trained for clerical work, being trained as subordinate workers for the colonial administration and for economic expansion. So at independence in 1980, the government then prioritized education because that was one of the main reasons why they were fighting for liberation. So because the colonial government, colonial education had been exclusionary, the new government then tried to expand education to the majority, and they really tried because if we look at the years between 1980 and 1989, a number of primary school students enrolled, they tripled from 800,000 to over 2.3 million. And there was substantial investment in higher education with about 25% of the national budget given to education. And if you look at education again, higher education, the only university at that time when we got our independence in 1980, it was the University of Zimbabwe, which was a college of the University of London. So most of the curriculum then, they were designed and modeled after the British higher education structures. And but the government tried to expand in terms of enrollment, giving student loans. Grants were introduced to help students from low-income families. Then, around the late 80s, that's when the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank and the IMF introduced different programs to global South countries, which were packaged as structural adjustment programs. And Zimbabwe was among the countries that were forced to adopt structural adjustment programs. And this led to reduction in the budget for higher education, and it led to some strikes, students agitating for more support, and it had some impact as students dropped. Those from poor backgrounds couldn't afford to go to the university. And was for public institutions, universities, students' infrastructure was in bad shape, and it was really challenging. So, in order to respond to students and lecturers who were complaining, there arose an authoritarian government in Zimbabwe, which dealt harshly with students and lecturers who were striking. So, while the government was the custodian of education, trying to provide education, at the same time, they were now forced to do some of the measures which were actually against the provision of quality education. So some of the challenges that came along with this was that there was a lot of dropouts, as I have said. Then in terms of promotion in administration at public university, there were now promotion based on political affiliation, which ultimately led to poor quality of education. Then the government, in 1999, a commission was set up by the president to look into the whole education setup, which was called Nazarbayev Commission. And it looked at the whole system. Among the points that it raised were that the system needed to move away from a colonial system. They needed to provide, to have a framework, an indigenous framework, and they proposed Ubuntu as a basis for all education systems in Zimbabwe. But this was ever taken up because of lack of political will. Then in 2018, the government came up with another model, which is currently being promoted, called Education 5.0 and heritage education-based curriculum. So this, they said, it's premised on some 5 key elements, which are industrialization, innovation, market-driven, and is the basis for these 5 pillars. But again, they emphasized industrialization. They emphasized on market-driven outcomes and STEM subjects, which potentially sidelines the education essence in terms of the whole education philosophy. If you look at the humanities and the arts and the social sciences. So Education 5.0, while some might say it's pragmatic, it's mostly focused on employability and industrial relevance. And it doesn't even mention the Nziramasanga report. And I also have to say that these 2 reports, there is no mention of public good explicitly. It's implied in statements like education should be homegrown, education should have a heritage-based outlook, without really going into, real issues of how they are going to do that. So basically, these are the policies that are informing or have informed education in Zimbabwe. Next slide. Yes, so before maybe I move to Ubuntu philosophy, maybe let me say some of the limitations of the public-private good binary as it informs education. So Zimbabwe, like other post-colonial countries, our education system mirrors the former colonizer. So ours mostly mirrors the British system, and it creates problems when it comes to issues of equity. So one of the challenges, again, with the binary is that it fails to account for the communal African knowledge systems, which are at the bedrock of communities and societies in Zimbabwe. So unlike most Western models, which often frame education as a linear progression towards individual success, most African pre-colonial education systems, they see knowledge acquisition as community-driven and morally embedded and holistic. So, however, these traditional values have increasingly been marginalized in the curriculum in countries like Zimbabwe. So, but I think that there's value in these traditional values, is especially in contemporary challenges that we are facing. And that's where I bring in Ubuntu philosophy. So Ubuntu philosophy is an African Bantu philosophy of relational interdependence, which challenges the dichotomy between public and private goods. And it challenges this dichotomy by asserting that an individual's well-being is inseparable from the community's well-being. And this is captured well when we greet each other in Zimbabwe, in my native language. When we see each other in the morning, we say, Mamuka say, meaning, how have you slept? And the person would respond as Tamuka Kanamamkau, meaning that we have slept well if you have slept well. So we basically, it captures the relational and communal approach to how these communities relate, that my well-being is dependent on your well-being. I cannot say I'm well when you are not well. And again, a lot of people have written about Ubuntu philosophy, showing how an individual relates to the other individual. But I think we we have expanded this notion to say that if you look really into some of the nuances around this philosophy, the we that is within Ubuntu transcends beyond human relations. It also includes non-humans, including the natural environment, including the living individuals, and those who have departed. If you look at the spiritualism, African spiritualism, and the future generations, those who are to come. So when we say I am, because we are, we will be looking at all those entities. And the Ubuntu philosophy is captured well by Thabo Mbeki, former South African president's poem entitled I Am an African. And I have just tried to capture some of the stanzas in his poem where he says, I owe my being to the hills and the valleys, the mountains and the glades, the rivers, the deserts, the trees, the flowers, the seas, and the ever-changing seasons that define the face of our native land. At times and in fear, I've wondered whether I should concede equal citizenship to, of our country to the leopard and the lion, the elephant and the springbok, the hyena and the black mamba, and the pestilential mosquito. I owe my being to the koi and the sun, whose desolate souls haunt the great expanses of the beautiful Cape. They who fell victim to the most merciless genocide our native land has ever seen. They who were the first to lose their lives in the struggle to defend our freedom and independence, and they who, as a people, perished in the result. So, Thabo Mbeki's words highlight the profound interconnectedness between humanity and the natural world, echoing the core tenets of Ubuntu. He emphasizes not only a shared geographical space, but also a shared history, including the painful legacy of colonialism and genocide. This interconnectedness extends beyond the present, acknowledging the contributions of the past generations and implying a responsibility towards the future ones. Ubuntu philosophy insists that a person's well-being is entangled with the well-being of others, the physical and the spiritual environments, and the future generation. Extending this interdependence, Ubuntu philosophy fosters relationships among humans. It broadens its ethical reach to include non-human animals and the spiritual world, promoting a holistic view of a community where the public and the private intersect. Mercy adds another interesting dimension to the conceptualization of Ubuntu. His latest publication, he argues that the individual must also cultivate personal internal harmony and ensure that one's actions towards oneself are as respectful as they should be towards others. As such, one should also pay attention to maintaining one's integrity and health, not just for personal benefit, but as a crucial aspect of community contribution. You cannot contribute to the way when you are failing to take care of the I. So the central idea is that the personal identity and flourishing are possible only through harmonious relations with one's community. And that community includes the human and non-human entities, which are foundational to authentic personhood. This is similar to what Paul Freire said: world and human beings do not exist apart from each other. They exist in constant interaction. And this is exactly what Ubuntu philosophy also argues. Then there are some people who have critiqued Ubuntu philosophy for various reasons, and some of them, they say that they raise arguments about its application, arguing that it might compromise individual autonomy by prioritizing the community interest over personal interest. And this is the same argument that was raised by Arandi, who said that an absolute alignment between the individual and the collective may create conditions for conformity rather than critical thought. But my response is that if these responses are made against Ubuntu philosophy. It's a short sight in the sense that these critiques stem from a limited view and interpretation of Ubuntu, because a more balanced Ubuntu philosophy not only promotes communal welfare but also respects individual rights. One can flourish in a Ubuntu system and without compromising one's individual aspirations. So a well-theorized Ubuntu philosophy or Ubuntu approach does not erase individuality, but integrates it in a relational framework of mutual responsibility. By doing so, it offers an alternative to both individualism and rigid collectivism. Therefore, the perceived shortcomings of Ubuntu philosophy should not be seen as flaws inherent to the philosophy itself, but rather as issues with its limited interpretation and narrow operationalization. So that's my thinking around Ubuntu philosophy, that when it's really embraced in its full richness and widest approach, it is a robust framework that can address the societal challenges, which by integrating respect, deliberation, and consensus. I will not go much into the other details of Ubuntu, but I wanted to say that a colleague, one colleague actually brought in Ubuntu philosophy into this public-private goods debate. And his discussion were around the contributions that are made by South African graduates. He was talking about what is called black tax, where after you have graduated, you have an obligation to give something to those who have made it possible for you to succeed and access higher education. But my departure from his argument is that his discussion, when he was discussing this issue, concept of black tax, his framework still acknowledges this binary of education as a public, is a public good. So he's still operating within the traditional public-private distinction. So in contrast, what I'm trying to propose here is an expanded approach where Ubuntu philosophy does not even view these two, the public and the private good, as separate entities, but inherently fused and inseparable, as shown in the next slide. Can you move to the next slide? Yes, yeah, this one, where we combine both the public and the private and come up with what we might call a shared relational good. And the difference between these three is that the relational shared the relational shared good will not separate these two, because again, if you go back to the definition of Ubuntu, it says, I am because we. I derive my happiness if you are also happy. So there is no separation of the public and the private. Rather, they are all intersected in one. So that's how I envisage an Ubuntu-based approach to this public-private binary. So move to the next slide, Camille. Yeah. So while neoliberal policies have reinforced these market-driven models, the public, the versus private, and state-led approaches have struggled with resource constraints. Ubuntu philosophy offers an alternative. By viewing education as a shared relational good, Ubuntu philosophy moves beyond the rigid dichotomy, advocating for a model that integrates collective responsibility, ethical participation, and intergenerational equity. This shift is vital in especially post-colonial contexts, where the legacies of colonial education, economic inequalities, and global market forces continue to shape access to knowledge and opportunity. Realizing higher education as a shared relational good requires recognizing internal and external constraints shaping higher education in countries like Zimbabwe and identifying actionable alternatives that align with Ubuntu philosophy's principles. So there's often a claim that most African governments, including Zimbabwe, countries like Zimbabwe, they lack resources to sustain higher education as a relational good. I think this is a misleading approach because most countries in Africa, if you talk about Zimbabwe, if you talk about South Africa, if you talk about DRC and those countries, they don't lack resources. There's plenty of natural resources to sustain higher education. Zimbabwe possesses significant natural and human resources, yet political mismanagement, corruption, and external financial pressures have commodified education. The issue is not financial incapacity, but political priorities favoring short-term economic gains over long-term societal development. At the same time, financial institutions like IMF and the World Bank have pressured African states to adopt cost-saving mechanisms, market-driven funding models, and structural adjustment policies that have been detrimental to the to access and success in higher education for most students. An Ubuntu-based approach to higher education funding requires a fundamental shift, not just on who pays, but how education is conceptualized. So how, in the first place, I think we should take a step back, and reflect on the purpose of education. The purpose of education is to solve societal problems and the challenges that disrupt the harmonious relations between the I and the we. So that should be the basis of measuring whether a higher education or any education is successful or not. So instead of this approach of measuring the success of education by these metrics that are given, we should take a step back and reflect on the purpose of education. So instead of only depending on donor funding, Zimbabwe and African countries should establish regional partnership based on mutual respect and cooperative investment. For example, the Southern African Development Community, a group of all Southern African countries, could establish regional partnerships and regional higher education fund which will ensure financial stability through cross-border contributions and shared academic resources. which might support a regional credit transfer system. Similarly, a graduate contribution scheme in which those who benefit from higher education contribute towards those who are going to come, the future generation, would reflect Ubuntu philosophy's commitment to intergenerational reciprocity. Botswana's One Man, One Beast initiative, which mobilized local communities to contribute to the establishment of the University of Botswana by selling one cow per each family, provides a compelling model for collective ownership of higher education. Also, the previous Tanzania's Ujamaa informed education for self-reliance, where context-specific education served all who got it, not just an elite, should also be pursued. So by fostering a culture of communal responsibility, such models challenge the neoliberal assumption that education is an individual commodity rather than a social shared good. So these efforts must also be situated within the broader global context of educational inequality. So here we can talk of forging what others might call subaltern international solidarities, where we include all marginalized higher education institutions and their communities, even within the global north. These solidarities should aim to bridge the gaps between the global academic elite and institutions serving represented communities, to ensure that the benefits of international cooperation extend beyond traditional power centers. So by doing so, we can work towards a more just and inclusive global educational landscape that values diverse perspectives and equitably distributes resources. So in terms of the governance models, an Ubuntu-based approach would favor a participatory decision-making mechanisms, which involves students, for example, faculty and local communities. Here I have an example, like a proposal where one approach might be establishing what might be called Ubuntu councils as advisory and governance bodies of students, educators, community leaders, and industry stakeholders. These councils will act as inclusive forums for decision-making, that higher education remains ethically and socially grounded rather than simply meeting state demands. This model aligns with traditional African governance practices where collective discussions, inclusivity, and consensus guided decisions at what they would call diaries or quota meetings, where people would sit and collectively deliberate on matters. Then on funding models, I have talked about regional partnership. Then on curriculum reforms, here we should go beyond integrating indigenous knowledges, what others are calling decolonization, where we bring in indigenous knowledge systems to an unchanging and untransformed neo-colonial system. Rather, we should integrate indigenous knowledge alongside some favorable global academic standards while focusing on the communities the indigenous, and the homegrown priorities. So prioritizing ethical responsibility and social impact, the impact that our education is doing to the local communities, even with alongside it with global orientation over market-driven education. Next slide, come in. Yeah, so just to conclude, the rigid separation of higher education into public or private spheres does not fully capture its broad social value. Neoliberal approaches commodify education by treating it as a personal investment, while heavily centered state-led models restrict institutional autonomy and inclusive governance. Here, through this paper, I have attempted to illustrate that Ubuntu philosophy can provide an alternative because it dissolves this binary by viewing education as a relational good that connects personal success with communal well-being and intergenerational responsibility. Unlike Rotti's liberal distinction between the public and private spheres, Ubuntu philosophy views personal achievement as inseparable from the community's well-being, rendering the divide artificial and untenable. Beyond theory, this paper has proposed concrete policy alternatives, including participatory governance structures, funding models based on a shared responsibility, and success metrics, prioritizing social impact over market-driven higher education rankings. However, genuine and meaningful reforms require dealing with excessive government control over higher education, external financial pressures, and the continued dominance of Western knowledge systems. These challenges can be confronted through academic activism, regional cooperation, and South-South partnerships that foster equitable knowledge exchange, ensuring that Global South priorities shape global education. By reframing education as a shared good, Ubuntu philosophy provides a foundation for a higher education system that is non-transactional, non-hierarchical, non-extractive, and globally relevant. If fully embraced, this approach could position higher education, not only in Zimbabwe but in other countries, as leaders in shaping a more just, inclusive, and socially relevant global education landscape. Thank you. The next slide is just the other one. Is it the last one? Oh, that's the last one. Okay, I didn't share the slide with selective references that I have used, but I have mostly used Marginson's papers regarding the public-private good debates and Ubuntu philosophers who have looked at Ubuntu. So yeah, now thank you for this opportunity, and yeah, let's engage with these ideas that I'm still building. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Oliver. That was really timely and inspiring. So I'd like now to move towards the question section of the seminar. If people have any questions, can they please put up their hand, and I will facilitate. And if you have any comments or questions that you want to put into the chat, please do that as well. So any questions people have for Oliver? Paul.
Your hand's gone up.
Sorry about that. Buttons were playing up. Thanks for that, Oliver. I really enjoyed that presentation. I was really interested in what you were saying about the purposes of education and how that relates to addressing societal problems and promoting social harmony. Could you say a little bit more about whether there's particular societal problems you see education as effective for addressing, or do you mean any societal problem, or are there some that education wouldn't be the right mechanism for addressing it? And also a kind of similar thing in relation to harmony. You've talked a bit about the kind of sense of harmony, the collective and the individual, but there are particular forms of social harmony that you see education as particularly suitable for addressing. Thanks.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you so much for this question. Yeah, so some of the societal problems that I see, which are really related to Ubuntu philosophy, include things like environmental challenges that we are facing today, where I don't know, for whatever reason, the academia has not really named it as it should be. Currently it's packaged as climate change, which I have a problem with, because climate has always changed. It's its nature to change. But what is the issue here is about the exploitative nature of capitalism. I think that's what it should be named. The exploitative nature of capitalism is the one that has caused these environmental challenges that we are now facing, which we are, packaging as climate change. If you look at how I have described Ubuntu philosophy, to say that the we that is described here, it also includes the environment, because for us to survive, for me to survive as an individual, or for us to survive as a community, our survival also depends on how we are relating to the other parts of we's, which is the environment. So we are the custodians, and we should be good steward towards this issues to do with environmental issues. So that's one societal problem which can be addressed through this approach. Then for those who are in peace studies, we talk of conflicts, even within ethnic conflicts. If you look at what happened in Rwanda in 1994, the genocide, and Ubuntu comes in again to say, if we put it in our curriculum, I think education is well placed, because it has the power to change people's beliefs and ways of doing things. So again, issues to do with citizenship, education, our roles as individuals, tolerance, religious tolerance, tolerating or pluralism, and tolerating people with different views than us, So those are some of the problems I think that can help us in terms of education, and they also tie also to issues of harmony. That if I believe that for someone other than me to be happy it should start with me, then we can inculcate this value of harmonious relations among people, among communities. Even if we have differences do not necessarily mean that we should fight or there's a conflict. So those are some of the issues that I think can be addressed by this approach. I don't know if I answered you well, but
Yeah, no, that's really helpful, Oliver. Thank you. And I just, it just made me think that kind of sense of, I would always see knowledge as collective, and that collectivism of Ubuntu is really important. And we kind of live in a particular age of denial, and that denial is very much based on individualism. So there's something about the power of collective ways of experiencing our world that seems to contain a sense of a way of addressing this kind of hugely damaging denial that, there's always been denial, but it has a particular accent and a particular tone and a particular damaging form at the moment. But thank you. That's really, really helpful. And, I really enjoyed your talk. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you both. That was really interesting discussion there. So does anyone else have any questions for Oliver? Kathy, you've got your hand up. You want to go ahead?
Hi, Oliver.
Hi, Jürgen.
Thank you very much for your talk. I really enjoyed it. I was interested that you mentioned Tanzania and the sort of philosophy there and how that's fed into ideas around Ubuntu and sort of that sense of community. And I wondered if you could say a little bit more about that, because I worked in Tanzania for 4 years, and I was there in the 90s when the ideas around Ujamaa was sort of, you were really starting to see them in the next generation. So when you ask people where they were from, people would say, oh, well, my mother was from here and my father was from here, but I had to go to secondary school in a different part of the country because that was the rule. And as a civil servant, as a teacher, I couldn't work in my home district. I had to work somewhere else. So we're all mixed up now. We're a much bigger community. But at the same time, I could see that, the primary responsibility that people had, it was to family, but it wasn't to individual family. It was to a much broader family, but that didn't extend to the whole community. So I could see lots of tensions going on there. So I wondered how, from your perspective, what happened in Tanzania was influential.
Yeah, thank you so much. I don't have much history about Tanzania, but what I can say is, if you look at this concept of Ubuntu, Ubuntu in literature, it's mostly known as Ubuntu because the people who wrote about Ubuntu were mostly from South Africa, but it's known by different names across sub-Saharan Africa. So in Tanzania, it's Ujamaa. In Kenya, it's Harambee. In Zimbabwe, it's Wunu, and so forth. So if you look, in Tanzania, it was popularized by the former president, the first president after independence, Julius Nyerere. And the idea was self-sustenance, that education has no meaning if it doesn't help the person, if it doesn't equip the person who is receiving it to solve societal challenges. So there were those Ujamaa villages, but this is my own views regarding what happened in Tanzania. It was unfortunate that when Nyerere was promoting Ujamaa and this relational ethos, it coincided with the collapse of the Soviet Union, or the end of Cold War. And anything associated with socialism or communism was condemned as if it was evil, you know. And then we entered into this neoliberal market-driven agendas. But I don't think that Ujamaa on its own failed. It didn't fail because it was bad, but it failed because of external pressures, just like any other system which was opposing capitalism then. So that's what I would say, because if you look at even again, I refer to Rwanda after 1994, they went back to pre-colonial systems they adopted. And one of the systems that they adopted was how can we try the genocide perpetrators when we have few judges? And they went back to their tradition of what they call gachacha courts, which are locally based courts where people sit down, they talk about an issue, then they resolve it. And it solved many cases. So you can see pockets of where things that were once condemned are now working. So yeah, that's what I would say about Ujamaa.
Thank you. That's really interesting. I think the sort of overtones in what you were saying about Ubuntu and collectivism and community, sort of, I could see where the undertones of communism might make it something that would be quite challenging in some context. So that's quite interesting to pick that up. Has anybody else got any more questions for Oliver? Got time for a few more.
Maybe when in the meantime, whilst we're waiting for another question, I would say in terms of the context where the Ubuntu will work in other contexts outside of maybe sub-Saharan Africa or in Western context. I'll give you an example of like in social work in the UK currently in social work. I think in the 90s and early 2000s, there was a practice where councils would take children away from their families. Let's say one is like a parent is into drugs or something, they would take those children and put them into care, mostly away from their immediate families, and they'll be raised then. But they have since realized that it really doesn't work well. Most children who come out of those systems have challenges. So now they are promoting a system where if a mother is the one who is a problem, they won't take a child away to the council or to the social services. They would rather look for a relative, immediate relative who can look after the child. So they are promoting families. And it ties well with Ubuntu philosophy in that we are all related. We cannot say that a child is raised by the state as if there is no one close to that child. So there are many instances where we can see some pockets of Ubuntu-based principles being applied even in non-global South contexts. So, yeah, I just wanted to highlight that.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's very, very interesting point. So has anybody got any more questions, or I think we might be ready to wrap up. Well, thank you so much, Oliver, for that seminar that was really, really thought-provoking, as I say, very, very timely. I think I agree with Paul there that it was very relevant to the time. So the next online session will be on Wednesday, the 5th of March at 12:30, and will be presented by Dr. Louis Major. The title is Educational Technology and Personalised Learning, Key Concepts, Critical Reflections and Recommendations for Design. Hopefully we'll all be able to join and have more discussions that will bring more illumination. So thank you so much, Oliver. If anyone's thought of any questions before we go, please chip in, and if not, then thank you very much, and I think we can wind up.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentation and your time.